Welcome everyone to Wednesday Night at the Lab. I'm Tom Zinnan. I work here at the UW-Madison Biotechnology Center. I also work for UW Extension and Cooperative Extension, and on behalf of those folks and our other co-organizers, Wisconsin Public Television, the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and the UW-Madison Science Alliance, thanks again for coming to Wednesday Night at the Lab. We do this every Wednesday night, 50 times a year. Tonight, it's my pleasure to welcome back to Wednesday Night at the Lab Robert Thorne. He's a professor in the School of Pharmacy here. He was born in Seattle, Washington, and he went to high school at John F. Kennedy High School near Washington in a town west of Seattle called Burien. I should have said near Seattle. He went to the University of Washington and as an undergrad and majored in chemical engineering. Then he went to the University of Minnesota and got his PhD in pharmaceutics and neuroscience. Then he went to New York University at the medical school at NYU and did a postdoc. In 2010, he came to UW-Madison. Tonight, it's a pretty pressing issue, the whole issue of biomedical research, ethics, higher purposes, and challenges going forward. It's been a pressing issue since we've had medicine and pharmacy, and I think it's going to be interesting to hear how Robert has taught his students over the years and how things are changing year by year and in some cases week by week as new case studies develop. So would you please join me in welcoming Robert Thorne back to Wednesday Night at the Lab.
Thank you, Tom. So it's a real pleasure as always to come here. As he said, I was here a year and a half ago talking about something totally different. So I'm going to share with you today really maybe what it's like to be a student a little bit here and learn about research ethics, what we try to impart, what the perspective is on the challenges that we face today. I've always been interested in ethics. I've always been in science, but I've taken a number of ethics courses at the University of Washington, at University of Minnesota, and then I've taught ethics at two institutions here and then previously in New York. So I've taken hopefully some lessons away from that over time. Now, if I was going to talk to you about my research, which is studying essentially the physiology of brain fluids and the circulation of fluids in the brain and how that affects drug delivery, particularly of large molecules, antibodies, viral vectors for gene therapy, if I was going to do that, I would start with a disclosure. And indeed, a year and a half ago when I was before you, I did start with a disclosure, just like this, where I acknowledge I periodically receive honoraria for speaking to various entities, sometimes companies. I'm an inventor on patents and patent applications. And I occasionally also serve as a consultant to companies, Genentech, Shire, Denali Therapeutics, and other entities, some legal consulting. And so I'm not going to talk about my research today, but I start with something that really, it bears on research ethics. Why do I disclose? Why do I talk about this? It's really to let you know what my background is and if I have any conflicts of interest. And so this is a topic that we get into when we teach our students research ethics when they're starting their PhDs. And you might think, well, this is a pretty simple concept, right? But even very recently, maybe some of you saw this in the New York Times a little over a week ago, there was the chief medical officer, Dr. Jose Baselga at Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York City. He's one of the world's foremost experts on cancer. He previously he was the president of the American Association for Cancer Research, and among many things that organization does is it sets guidelines for things of how to conduct research, what to do, how to disclose your potential conflicts. And the reason he was in the news is he didn't do this himself. Dozens and dozens of publications in some of the best journals. And about 5 days later, he was relieved of his position at Memorial Sloan Kettering. So I think that, it may be a trivial thing sometimes, and certainly he must have thought so. But even something simple like just starting out your talk or having something in your paper that you publish saying, these are my conflicts, I wish to disclose this. You can see the ramifications, even for someone at the very top end of the cancer research field in the clinical area. So what I hope to talk with you about now and give you a little bit of a flavor of is how we approach some of these issues at the university, not only here but other universities. How do we talk about ethics in science? And I guess the one place to start is to differentiate between research mistakes and misconduct. Lots of people, I think, maybe junior graduate students often and the lay public might think that when there are problems in the research literature that, oh, well, probably a lot of that's just an honest mistake. If a paper's really wrong and then it's retracted, maybe that's just error. Someone made a mistake and they didn't catch it. And the truth is actually the opposite, unfortunately. So when I usually have to explain to our students what Calvin and Hobbes is, and maybe this audience I don't have to do that. So a cartoon by Bill Watterson, and I've always liked this one. So Calvin's talking to Hobbes, his imaginary friend. I don't believe in ethics anymore. As far as I'm concerned, the ends justify the means. Get what you can while the getting's good. That's what I say. Might makes right. The winners write the history books. It's a dog-eat-dog world, so I'll do whatever I have to do and let others argue about whether it's right or not. And then Hobbes pushes him. Hey, it's in the mud. Why'd you do that? You were in my way. Now you're not. The ends justify the means. I didn't mean for everyone, you dolt, just me. Ethics and what people want to have as their guiding principle sometimes is dictated by which end they're on. And so the ends justify the means is sort of Machiavellian concept. So what is an ethical guiding principle? So we have to kind of, I'll start you right, like if we were at the very beginning of our research ethics course, which we've just started one for about 40 graduate students in pharmaceutical sciences and in the Institute for Clinical and Translational Research, the graduate program in clinical investigation. And so we have to start kind of at the beginning. So ethics, it's in the realm of philosophy, and so philosophers divide ethics into two areas. There's normative ethics. This is where you try to establish what's morally right and wrong with respect to an action. And this is really where we typically are in applied ethics, in biomedical ethics, and in research ethics in science. This is the area that we tend to reside in. Then there's this sort of more scholarly consideration, metaethics, and this is really for philosophers to sit around and debate moral concepts. I won't say much about that. Concepts of duties, rights, moral reasoning. Maybe a little more pertinent is ethical theories. And so there are two real broad categories of ethical theories. One is based on consequences. Consequences drive it entirely. This is the teleological or consequentialist group of theories. And this is where right or wrong is exclusively a function of what happens, of the outcomes. And probably the best example of a teleological theory is utilitarianism. So where you're trying to maximize the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Pretty simple. That's the goal. And you can contrast that with deontological theories, which are after Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, and these are duty-based. So these say, okay, forget consequences. You have a duty. It doesn't matter if it achieves the greatest good or not. You're motivated by a duty. And some classic examples of this would be the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them to do unto you. The Hippocratic oath in medicine, the principle of maleficence, first do good, and then non-maleficence, first do no harm, are duty-based examples. So what we often try to do is take that and simplify it down for PhD students. So the simplified approach might be, say, well, if you distill it all down, what's the point? Do the right thing. Avoid misconduct. And the challenge sometimes in science and in medicine is that you kind of feel like you're put in situations where you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. And sometimes you're forced to choose one way or another way. And so how do you go about that? This is one of the big things that we try to impart on students, so a way of thinking through problems. So back to this question about misconduct and mistakes, what distinguishes them? So scientific misconduct involves deliberate deception. And you got the three main parts of that. One is fabrication, you just make it up. Another is falsification. And then last is plagiarism. Plagiarism is where you copy or you take some intellectual property, some passage of another person, and you pass it off as your own without proper attribution. So these are the big ones. What are the common motivations that drive people to do that, particularly at universities or in high-level science? So one is career pressure. Lots of faculty and students and postdocs are under pressure to succeed, pressure to publish, pressure to be productive, pressure to achieve certain metrics, this many papers a year. Certain departments will actually tell their junior faculty, we need this many, 5 a year. So there's pressure. Another is a belief maybe that you might know the answer, and so I don't want to do all this work to get there. I'll take a shortcut and I'll get there quicker. And then another is, this is maybe a little bit more of a nefarious one, is if someone is trying to cover up their tracks. The idea that certain experiments are just so complicated, science has become so complex that certain experiments, even for those people right in the same field, it's hard for them to really check and really reproduce it, even if they wanted to and they had the resources to do so. So if someone wants to cross over to the dark side in such an area, of course, it's a little bit easier to escape detection. So in science, there's also work structures, the way we do the sort of the organization of laboratories that sometimes can lead to conditions that are the misconduct's more likely to arise. And so there's some nice work on this by Sidney Brenner, the Nobel Prize winner. And so what are these work structures? Well, some labs are really big. And sometimes the PI, the principal investigator, is never in the laboratory. They're in their office, it might be down the hall, it could be on a different floor. They may be traveling a lot, they're on the lecture circuit. The more famous the scientist, the more often they travel. So the connections between the principal investigator and the bench are sometimes not direct. That can be dangerous sometimes. Mistakes can be amplified if bench scientists are afraid to correct mistakes. I often say, so you're a beginning graduate student, you come up with an amazing result, you show it to your principal investigator, your advisor, and they're so excited. And a week later, the advisor is already working on a grant for $5 million. And then a couple days later, you realize, you made a mistake. You've got to go to you knock on the door and you say, you know that $5 million grant yeah, that was my bad. So the student has to feel comfortable enough, empowered by the PI to say, oh, this was my mistake, and not feel pressure to then, oh, but I can't correct it now. You know, and these are real examples. That's why we bring them up. So, you know, sometimes there can be a cooperative crime. If someone commits misconduct or maybe makes a mistake in that example and then doesn't correct it, if the PI has created a situation in the laboratory where people don't feel comfortable speaking out and saying, you know, I made a mistake, then that's a problem. So, I mean, all this really gets back to the idea that we have to be open about our mistakes in science, and we have to be transparent. It is absolutely essential. Many mistakes are unintentional, and sometimes they're even unavoidable. Why do we have to be accountable to the public and politicians? Well, it's pretty obvious. I mean, we govern ourselves. We're like a club. We're a privileged elite group. We have our own rules. If someone gets out of line, we're expected to police our own ecosystem, our own community. And the second point here is really important. However, even though that's true, other people pay the bill. The vast majority of research at a university like this is funded by federal money, taxpayer dollars. So we really have to be careful, and you know, this is a privilege to be able to be a club and to police yourself. And if you don't do it properly, then there's a nice long history of Congress stepping in to help you do it. And so one of the principles in science is that you have hypotheses and you test them. And many of these hypotheses are wrong. This is a quote I've always loved from the astrophysicist Carl Sagan. Hypotheses in science are sometimes wrong. It's perfectly all right. It's the aperture to finding out what's right. Science is a self-correcting process. This is something that I think is lost sometimes on people that do commit misconduct. If the result's important enough, if enough people care about it, eventually it's going to come to light. People are deluding themselves that if they think it's never going to, the fraud's not going to be discovered. Now, for the science that people don't care about, that's in the fringe, 1/3 of all papers in the scientific literature, 1/3 are not cited. To me, that's the most frightening statistic I know of. So there's a lot of work that people do not care about. So if there's fraud and misconduct in that work, then it's never going to be discovered. But the important results will be tested. And so it all gets back to public trust. I think particularly in today's world, as scientists, we have to be concerned with public trust. We should never, ever take it for granted. And then you go back to Nietzsche, the German philosopher. I also like this quote, is that it is very advisable to examine and dissect the men and women of science for once, since they, for their part, are quite accustomed to laying bold hands on everything in the world, even the most venerable things, and taking them to pieces. What we do as scientists is often to examine things down to real detail. And the whole idea of taking things apart, well, we also, as a group, have to be, you have to, if you're going to dish it out, you have to be able to take it. And so trust we can't take for granted. And we have to be willing and expect to be put under the microscope ourselves. So, challenges. So that's kind of like a little bit of an introduction that you'd have in a class. We talk about ethical theory. We talk about motivations. We talk about the need to communicate your work, the role of the public, the role of funding bodies. The graduate school at the University of Wisconsin, like many good graduate schools, is very international. So we have students from the United States, we have students from around the world. And so another big aspect of these sorts of courses is we're trying to get everybody on the same page. And so if you're coming from China or you're coming from India, then you need a little bit of an introduction about the National Institutes of Health and how the Department of Health and Human Services sets policy and what have you. So the other thing that we do is we talk about some history and we give examples. And I think a lot of ethics can be quite dry, particularly if you're talking about it in the context of science, unless you bring up some examples. And so I'll try to give you a little bit of a flavor of how we do that. So research ethics has a sometimes dark history. And some of the key parts that I'll tell you about that are important in teaching a course. When I teach about human experimentation, where do we start? We start in World War II. We start with the Holocaust. Why do we do that? Because Nazi medicine, the Nazi biomedical program, the classic slippery slope, started with racial hygiene ideas, with sterilization, and then went to medical killing, and ultimately mass murder and this life unworthy of life. Over 6 million Jews, Gypsies, Poles, homosexuals were killed in concentration camps. How does that relate to ethics? Obviously, it's wrong. Well, it turns out that after the war, these people, doctors, anthropologists, people in the pharmaceutical industry, had to be tried. And there wasn't a code. There wasn't some kind of ruling principle that, that everyone could agree on that had been in place for medical science. And so the Allies developed a code of ethics that they used to try these individuals in Nuremberg for the Nuremberg trials. And that Nuremberg Code of Ethics, it had two real prominent principles. One was that if you're a human being and you're going to be in a research study, This is a research study that was conducted by Germans. It was looking at, they did a lot of work on work, in quotes, looking at drowning. How long could people be in freezing cold water? And what could they do to help them recover from that? Because they were losing a lot of the German pilots. They were being shot down in cold seas. And so, two principles of the Nuremberg Code of Ethics. Informed consent. This individual did not consent to be put in cold water. And then the other is that unacceptable morbidity and mortality, death, being hurt, cannot be an endpoint, typically, in an experiment. So the Nuremberg Code of Ethics, you can trace that to today, to some of the principles that we have. The Nuremberg Code gave way to the Helsinki Code, and to a lot of what you can see today. And those two principles are still very prominent. Informed consent and morbidity and mortality, not an endpoint. Another example, animal experimentation. So this was kind of the Wild West at one point in science. It was unregulated, and then much like a lot of examples that we cover in class with students, it was exposed by journalists in the press that it was an unregulated industry. Some of these animals were being treated horribly. And out of that came the Animal Welfare Act in 1966. And we've long had, and we still do have, a very vigorous debate over animal rights. So we have human rights, and we have animal rights. And so then another real famous study, just to say a few words about it, would be the Tuskegee Study. Some of you may know about this. An absolutely horrid example of US research. So this was in the early 1930s. The Public Health Service began a study, in quotes again, to determine the course of untreated syphilis in 400 African American men from Macon County, Alabama. The men had syphilis, and that's really what they were studying. What they wanted to study was the course of untreated syphilis. The problem is about 15 years later, penicillin was discovered to be an effective therapy. These people that were conducting the study had a fork in the road. They decided then that they wouldn't tell these men that there was a therapy, and they would follow them because they thought this is the last chance they would have to follow the course of untreated syphilis. 25 years after that, again, a reporter finally exposed it. Syphilis patients died untreated. A year later, Congress, lots of investigations. The study was shut down, of course, and out of that came a whole bunch of new laws and acts, the National Research Act, to create a National Commission for the Protection of Research Subjects. Regulations should be codified, and to absolutely require human subjects research of any kind to be reviewed by an institutional review board. It wasn't all that long ago, 70s, when that really came about. And there was a presidential apology. This was, obviously this was just a corruption of, this is not, so there was another principle that was violated here. If information comes to light, as an investigator, you're responsible to tell your study participants. If something happens that would affect their consent, their willingness to be a part of the study, they need to know. So, jumping ahead to today, just giving you a flavor of some of the issues. So that's background. Some of the key cases that we use to sort of set the stage, and then talk about really what are the codes and the principles, and that can be sometimes a bit drier material. What about today? One of the big topics we have is the reproducibility crisis in science. A number of years ago, a couple of scientists with a company, Amgen, did an interesting study for their company where they tried to replicate some of the biggest, most important findings in the cancer field over the last 10 years. They did 53 studies. Ultimately, they were only able to replicate 11%. 11%, based on what was reported in the papers and how to do the work. Why did they do that? Well, Amgen had a stake. They wanted to know where are they going to put their chips? What are they going to invest in to go forward? So ironically, the reproducibility crisis is one area where our industry colleagues are way ahead of the academic community, because it's hard to get resources and money in academia to reproduce someone else's study. But in industry, they have a reason to do so, because they have to know if they can trust it before they're going to spend the next $5, $10, $20 million to develop it. And so lots and lots of work across many different fields has revealed this to be a big problem. Shifting gears again. Now let's go to misconduct. What kind of fraud is out there? What are some of the classic case studies that we talk about? So one in particular is at the highest levels. This fellow was the dean of a school, of a respected university in the Netherlands. Diederik Stapel, he was been the subject of a lot of articles. There was a really beautiful New York Times Magazine expose on him a few years back. So he was a Dutch social scientist, and he was an academic star. So any of you that are familiar with academia, he got his PhD in 1997. In 2000, he became a professor, that very quickly. And then by 2010, he'd moved to another university to become dean. So he had this meteoric rise. He was he was one of the most successful scientists in all of Holland. Hands down, no question about it. So what happened? So as written in this New York Times Magazine, that they have some quotes from him, he was convinced his hypothesis was valid. I said, you know what, I'm going to create the data set, he told me. He said he felt both terrible and relieved the results were published. I realized, hey, we can do this, he told me. What did he do? So the way some of this social science works, it's you're testing some hypothesis and looking at behavior, and you're trying to be sort of unobtrusive. And so his students and the people that work for him would come up with an idea, and then he'd have to run the study. He'd have to go and observe people somewhere. And so he would do that. He would take the studies devised by his students and then go off somewhere in the Netherlands and run the study. That was hard to do, and so eventually he said, well, you know, I'm confident in the hypothesis. Well, I'm not going to run the study. I'll just make up the data. So he pretended to run the study and then gave the data back to his graduate students. And so you might think, well, okay, well, what kind of research is that going to be? Well, here's one example. And for those of you who don't know, Science is a pretty good journal. It has what you'd call a high impact factor. Science, Nature, these are journals that people really compete to be in. And so this is an example of one of his studies. Coping with Chaos, How Disordered Contexts Promote Stereotyping and Discrimination. It's basically the idea that if someone is judging people and there's some trash in their line of view, they're going to judge more harshly. Explosive stuff. He made it all up. His career took off. He published many, many studies, many with his doctoral students. They didn't appear to have questioned why their supervisor was running many of the experiments for them, nor did his colleagues inquire about this unusual practice. Ultimately, at the end of 2011, the universities, there was a whistleblower, several whistleblowers, the students. And the universities unveiled a report at a joint news conference. He'd committed fraud in at least 55 of his papers. It affected 10 PhD dissertations written by his students. Those students' work is tarnished. All the time spent there. There's something, so there are a number of ways of following fraud and misconduct in science. One is a beautiful website put out, it's called Retraction Watch. And so there's such a thing as a Retraction Watch leaderboard. This is something you never want to be on. Because basically, at the top of the list is the most retractions. And that honor belongs to Yoshitake Fuji, who was an anesthesiologist in Japan, was an anesthesiologist. But Diederik Stapel is number 3. So takeaways from some of this that we talk about with specific cases in the class. If you were with me over the course of a whole semester, we'd get into it. Nearly all of the top 30 are men, not a single woman. The other thing that's kind of interesting is top 10, half of them are Japanese. So you can get into like the cultural aspects, obviously gender considerations in the causes of some of this. And so we talk about this. Again, this is relevant for diverse student bodies where we have students coming from all over the world. We want to try to understand. I learn from them as much as they learn from me. I'm trying to understand as well. Second example is a lot closer to home and a lot more junior. We've got a first-year PhD student in their first semester at this institution. And they were given a take-home exam. And this take-home exam involved them reading a paper, and then the instruction was, I'll read it because it may be hard for some of you to see, please summarize this paper and in all caps in your own words. And the answer from the student, so wherever you see yellow here is taken word for word from some source, Wikipedia or the paper itself. And what you should take away is there's not a whole lot of text that's not in yellow. And this is a part of his answer. So the next page also was equally bad. And so Wikipedia was sort of put together with another source that Wikipedia was not attributed. And so cobbling together of different things. And there's a name for that. It's called pastiche or really patch quilt plagiarism. And so that was this essay. And this particular student was also enrolled in a high-level graduate survey course on research ethics. The instructor, I won't divulge to you who that was, but you may be familiar with him after tonight. And so he also had to write a research paper. So we go back and we look at this research paper, and the topic that this particular student chose was particularly ironic. He wrote on plagiarism. You can't make it up. And so here's one source, and here's another source, and here's the paper that this particular student put out. And again, you notice hardly any text that's original, and there's a deceptiveness to this. So ultimately, cutting the what happened here? Well, there are lots of things that we have to do as a professor when you encounter this sort of thing. So these are students that would go on to work in laboratories, that would use federal money to do research. Is this the kind of person you would want in a laboratory like that, doing important work, maybe work even that would affect clinical studies? So this student got an F grade in the research ethics course and a failing grade in the other survey course. And then, graduate students come to us. They sometimes have already research productivity. This particular student had 2 first author publications in the literature. So we went back and we looked at that, and what do you think we found there? We found the same thing. Ultimately, this student voluntarily withdrew from the university. They were here 1 semester. Disaster for all involved. Certainly a disaster for him, disaster for us, and all of the work and resources we put into training these students. Are we doing enough to fight that at universities? Not just this place, but in general. So lots of universities subscribe to plagiarism checking software. Some do not. This is one that does not yet. Why do we not? Well, it's probably complicated. It comes down to resources. This is our own site for detection resources. While campus does not provide subscription access to these resources, individuals or departments may subscribe on their own. The really good software that's used by the best journals, Nature Publishing Group, Science, is subscription only. And they typically will only do subscriptions with the entire university, not departments or individuals. So you really need universities to invest in this, and as you can tell, this is the part where I'm sort of putting out an opinion. I think it's time we do this. There are lots of things that you should check at a university to make sure that it's original content. We can maybe talk more about that in the question and answer. So, lots of other problems science is facing, that I don't really have time to get into. We have a huge money problem in science. The NIH, the National Institutes of Health budget, doubled from 1998 to 2003. And then from 2003 to now, it's declined. It's less than 80% today what it was in 2003 if you adjust for inflation. So that's a problem. That's put a lot of pressure on individuals, scientists, investigators, students, postdocs, administrators at universities. Many studies, too many, are poorly designed. And some of the incentives are bad. Well, some studies, they reek of bias. Why do they? Well, they really need a result. Why do they really need a result? Well, then it gets back to funding, grants, money, that kind of thing. And so there are these perverse incentives for scientists to game their results. Replicating results is crucial, but it's rarely done, as I mentioned before. It's hard to get the resources to do it in academic science. Very expensive studies, very hard to do them twice and do them exactly the way they were done before, if they're real questions. Peer review. Some would say it's broken. Many, many papers and grants are not reviewed carefully enough. Most of us in academia, if we're going to be honest, we would admit to that. We've seen many examples. I certainly have. Too much science is locked behind paywalls, so you get into open versus closed access. If you're doing science in Africa, open access journals are very important, but of course a lot of them are not open access. Science is poorly communicated to the public, a huge, huge problem. If we're going to influence public policy and have sound public policy based on science, we as scientists have to communicate it effectively. And then lastly, life as a young academic, PhD student is incredibly stressful today. I think if we have students, they might attest to that. There's a long apprenticeship if you're doing a PhD, long apprenticeship, graduate school, postdoctoral fellowship, not very good wages all the way through, so it's a real delayed gratification scenario. So what to do? Last 15 minutes or so. So now I'm going to take a bit of a left turn and maybe think about, well, what prescriptions, what do we think about in teaching our own students to try to change some of the underlying dynamics? So what can we do? Well, one thing we could do is we could give up. We could ignore the problems. Or we could develop some kind of philosophy, have some kind of vision, some way of thinking about the issue. Another thing that I teach to our graduate students is how to communicate science, presentation design. And when I teach that, one of the things I like to use is some lessons from Steve Jobs. Limited lessons, focused. Jobs' favorite quote was, "Good artists copy, great artists steal," by Picasso, and really came from T.S. Eliot, "Talent imitates, but genius steals." Why did that speak to Jobs? Because Jobs wanted to take some of the best that he could identify in terms of design, and then even in advertisement, and merge, sort of put his products in the context of greatness, and then take something from what everyone would admit is greatness and put it into his products. And so when he turned Apple around in the 1990s, the ad campaign that did it was this "Think Different." Some of you may remember it. And so the idea was to take Einstein and Maria Callas, the opera singer, and other real luminaries, and say, oh, Apple, these people. So start with a philosophy, imitate greatness. So I tend to take this to heart. When I'm looking for ideas, I say, well, what's the best? I go to that, I try to study it, and then use it. So how many of you are familiar with this Michael Pollan book? Probably quite a few. Okay, so In Defense of Food and Eater's Manifesto, distilled down into some nice little punchy phrases. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. So if I take this same philosophy and I twist it around for myself, In Defense of Biomedical Research, a Scientist's Manifesto. I presented this to some of our own students not long ago. They asked me to give a sort of last lecture. I'm not dying. It's complicated. But so I did it, and so this is really the content that I came up with. So what is my manifesto? Study history at least a little, read widely, define goals. Now I'm not as good as Michael Pollan, so I got another list. Practice collaboration, communicate effectively, strive for excellence. Okay, study history at least a little. Students today often don't know a lot of the essential history. What I just told you, why do I start with the Holocaust and Nazi medicine when I'm talking about human experimentation? It's because 41% of Americans today don't know what Auschwitz is, concentration camp, and 66% of millennials, our students, do not know. So there's been a lot written about this. If you don't know the history, then the influence of what happened in the past is not there. And that old saying, history will repeat if you don't have a good sense of what came before, if you don't know it. And so I want to show you a very short little 2-minute clip from a film in the 1980s that talks a little bit about what lessons should we draw from the past at universities. Try again.
These are the remains of Joseph Mengele. During his time at Auschwitz, he carried out some of the most horrific experiments ever known. 400,000 people are said to have died at his hands. Many of the doctors who worked with him lived to continue their academic careers in peacetime Germany. So too did the professors who used his research. Professor Verschuer became professor of genetics at Munster University. He died a renowned scientist and a free man.
I think there's certainly a lesson to be learned, but of course the question is whether it will be learned. Mengele was a colleague. He was a colleague of ours. And he simply completely forgot that scientific without justice and with equal rights certainly ends up in a hell like Auschwitz. But I would say many colleagues are not willing to see that.
At that time, and still today, universities, of course, not only in the West, but also in the West, are educating what my colleague Franklin H. Littell of Temple University, Philadelphia, who is a Methodist minister and a minister of religion, professor of religion, called technically competent barbarians. And we seem to be educating that to this day. In other words, our university education, I'm speaking as a university professor, is not geared to the kind of society that we are educating towards. And it does not prepare us to oppose the kind of developments that might end up or lead to a Holocaust. And I think this is a tremendous challenge that Mengele poses for us, because Mengele is a product of the kind of system that we still have, of universities all over the world that teach techniques, that teach quote-unquote science, but not the implications of it and not the use to which such things are put.
So this is, I think it's still as pertinent today as it was in the 80s. We obviously have to teach context. This is why we teach research ethics. We don't have a choice. We are mandated by federal funding agencies to do it. And it really comes out. So in the 80s, you weren't mandated to do it. And these sorts of considerations led to some real meaningful change. And I think we've improved in certain areas. But then I think in other areas we've had challenges creep in, and certainly the money is probably the big change. So in the 1980s to now, the money is different in science, and so that's created more challenges that need to be dealt with. So one of my other prescriptions: read widely. I'm very proud, I have been very proud to be associated with the Pharmaceutical Sciences PhD program. It's based in the School of Pharmacy. We have 40% of our PhD students are from the US and 60% are international. We have typically about 50 to 60 students. This is a portion of them. Eating pizza, as graduate students are prone to do. I was with them, my daughter was there. And what I would emphasize here is, they come from all these different places. I mentioned this before: China, Ethiopia, Hong Kong, India, Korea, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, in addition to the United States. And so read widely. There's an opportunity there, when you're around such diversity. So my prescription, my plea for our students is to stay up and follow current events, know something about the world, choose an interesting book every so often. Where do your classmates, friends, and coworkers come from, and how has their experience been different from your own? This is one of the arguments for having diverse classes, is that our PhD students, any students, learn from their classmates about the world. There's probably no better education. We can't stand up and teach them about Asia probably as well as a classmate can that's from Asia. There are lots of other things that they could read about, particularly in graduate school, the backstory of what you're studying in neuroscience, neurodegenerative diseases. There are lots of examples like that. What famous person had the disease that you research? What are the costs? Next prescription, define goals. Think about your life's narrative. Where have you come from? What do you wish to be your motivating principles? And I'll show you another short clip. This is President Barack Obama, former President Barack Obama, talking about the influence of his mother, an anthropologist, Ann Dunham, and the values that carried him forward.
Woman, born in Kansas, traveled around a lot when she was young. So she ends up in Hawaii. She's a student. She meets this
first African student to be admitted to the University of Hawaii.
Yeah. And they have this brief affair. They get married quickly, divorced quickly. I am a byproduct of that. And then he's gone. And so she, along with my grandparents, basically raised me. She remarries again, this time to an Indonesian, and we traveled to Jakarta in 1967. I lived there for 4 years before moving back to Hawaii. And she ended up specializing in women's development issues. She was one of the pioneers in microfinancing, where you'd go into a village and women who were doing all kinds of work, but they weren't getting paid for it, figuring out how they could monetize what they were doing, and ended up being a tool to empower them and create more development in poor countries. And when I think about the values that carried me forward, they trace to her. She was very much a child of the 60s and a little bit of a skeptic about a lot of things, but what was interesting was she hung on to some very basic kind of Midwestern values. Be honest, be kind, be useful, be responsible, work hard, treat everybody with respect. When I think about the work that I ended up doing, there's no doubt that some of that rubbed off.
Yeah.
Basic Midwestern values. Be honest, be kind, be useful, be responsible, work hard, treat everybody with respect. So in showing this to students, I'm not saying to them, adopt former President Obama's goals. I'm saying, think about your own. We can all think about, what is the narrative of our life and how do we want it to proceed? And I think it's much more important when you're in your 20s to do that. Practice collaboration. Practice collaboration. So I trained in New York City, and there's this classic joke. A tourist says to a New Yorker, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Carnegie Hall is the famous music venue. And the New Yorker says to the tourist, practice, practice, practice. So how do you practice collaboration? Like anything, it can be practiced. So if you're a beginning student, you do it with your classmates first. You join a laboratory, you do it in the laboratory. I think something that needs to be stressed more often in laboratories is that there should be a real heightened expectation of collaboration, not competition, because it teaches students to collaborate with the people that they're around, the next bench over. And then they get good at that, and ultimately they're going to do it outside of the lab, ultimately outside of the university. And that's a kind of a testing ground for them to learn how to do it, what the benefits are, what works for them. Many different characteristics and traits and personalities. What works for one person doesn't necessarily work for another, so students have to figure that out. And so you have to practice it to get good at it. Communicate effectively. I've mentioned that already. The tremendous importance of communicating science. No more important maybe than it is today. A book, Peter Feebleman, PhD is not enough. However brilliant your insights, they will be of little use if you cannot make them appear interesting to others. This is kind of 101 for junior scientists when they go to present their work at the first conference that they ever go to. What do you start with? Why should you care? Someone comes up and says, "Ah, that looks interesting," or maybe they come up and say, "Why should I be interested in this?" You've got to be able to answer that second question powerfully. Communication is not just verbal. Increasingly, we have graphical communication. A picture is worth 1,000 words. That has become even more so and more important in science. You see many, countless examples of this, as this cover of a high impact factor journal Cell illustrates, with a beautiful picture of the heart, sort of likening it to a tree, and the creation of new cells as these cherry blossoms down here. Strive for excellence. Strive for excellence in your work, in your everyday life. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit. It's one of my favorite quotes for my own graduate students. Excellence becomes a habit if you do it enough. And so this is often attributed to Aristotle. A little more complicated than that. It's actually attributed to a Pulitzer Prize winning author that was paraphrasing Aristotle almost 100 years ago in a book. The point, though, it kind of gets back to what I said about Steve Jobs in that campaign, and good artists copy, great artists steal. Begin by copying the excellent traits and habits of others. Not literally copying, but trying to add in what makes it great. If you're thinking about graphics, maybe you go to a museum and you say, what works? And then you bring it into science. The best science crosses over and can become art. But you have to have something to say yourself when done. So this is really the path and the arc that you take as a graduate student. By the end, you need to have your own voice, and you need to be able to speak and talk pretty powerfully, convey your story, your major points. Make sure you get your facts straight, quote when appropriate, quote correctly and accurately, and don't trust Wikipedia. So if you trusted Wikipedia, sometimes you attribute quotes the wrong way. So last slide, last few points. So this is kind of bonus. It's not on my list. It's some quotes that we also can pass along to our students. So, in God we trust, all others must bring data. Who do you think came up with a phrase like that? Well, of course, it was a statistician. So now these are sort of tests for our graduate students sometimes. Not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. Who came up with that? Of course, it's Einstein. If you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. That's Einstein again, who won the 1921 Nobel Prize in Physics. And then science has great beauty. One of the most famous pictures from science, the Solvay Conference in 1920s on physics. All men except for Marie Curie, who won 2 Nobel Prizes before Albert Einstein won his only. And of course, she saw the beauty in science. So I've been really privileged over my career here to work with outstanding individuals. So by way of acknowledgement, when you teach and when you work with students in the laboratory, I think you often learn as much from them as they learn from you. That's the ideal situation. And so I'm definitely in that category. I've had a number of fantastic students working with me over the years. And I hope you enjoyed it tonight. I look forward to any questions you may have. Thank you very much. Yes?
On one of the first slides, you said error was inevitable, and then you just breezed on past that, and I'm just curious.
Well, so mistakes, maybe, so, you know, like some, perhaps if you have a design of an experiment and you don't fully understand what you're studying, you might perhaps design an experiment that could give you an answer, but the basic design of the experiment could be wrong. So it might give you an answer that reinforces your hypothesis, but maybe, you know, when you learn more, you'd look back and say, oh, the design was wrong. I could see why I concluded that was right. So I think that's what's meant by that. You know, sometimes mistakes are unavoidable. You know, that kind of thing. Science is hard. Science is hard. So most subjects, unless they're brand new, there's not a whole lot of low-hanging fruit. It's difficult, and it involves a lot of complex technology, and there are lots of places along the way where you can come off the rails. So you've always got to be reflective and questioning, and you ideally are going to be slow to accept your own, proving your own hypothesis. You have to be your own worst critic. And so that's where you really get the conflict today, that you can see. So science today is a lot of people feel pressure to never admit being wrong, to never correct their mistakes. Someone points out they're wrong, they don't want to issue the correction in the journal. They fight it tooth and nail. Why do they do it? It ultimately does come down to resources and money in science. Admitting you're wrong, if you admit too much, then others will, you know, can use that against you. So it's, science has, the money has changed science. One of the favorite quotes I have is from a professor I had at the University of Minnesota who said, Jan Dubinsky, a neuroscientist, and she said when she got into neuroscience and got into academia, we were all meant and expected to be deep thinkers. Today we're expected to be entrepreneurs. There's a world of difference between those two perspectives. And so there's nothing wrong with the entrepreneurial world. But science is, you know, what the purpose of science, you could argue, you know, is to seek truth. One of the questions we have in the course, you know, we talk about some of these examples. We talk about that chief medical officer who was just relieved of his duties at Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York City, a giant in cancer research. And then there was another article earlier in the week. There was a Goldman Sachs investment banker who was a whistleblower who also lost his job. There's a big scandal in the crossword world. Will Shortz's New York Times crosswords have been plagiarized for a number of years by the guy who was putting together the USA Today universal crosswords. Why is there typically more public condemnation, outrage about the physician in New York treating cancer patients, or a scientist, than there is the crossword plagiarism or the Goldman Sachs investment banker? Probably more of you know about the medical example than the other ones I mentioned. And it's probably, you know, if it's medicine, it's human beings, you're treating people. You can hurt them. If it's science, you're seeking truth. The essence of it is to seek truth. If you're a Goldman Sachs banker, what's the goal? It's to build wealth. That's different than seeking truth. So the purpose and the goal influences the stakes and maybe how much emphasis we should put on trying to preserve it as best we can. Tom.
At a lot of universities, I've experienced it as a graduate student here, but part of the way that people would teach is to emphasize case studies from this university. Do you look for, find, and teach case studies in ethics and fraud specifically from here?
So certain ones. The plagiarism example is a good one. I've used that a number of times, and in order to really teach this stuff effectively, you've got to have examples that are really pertinent, and there can be no sort of areas that you're not afraid to go into. And so I think, you know, the best cases are real life, first off. And if you have a case from your own university that you know about, and then you de-identify it, you know, it's you don't reveal the names, obviously. You do it in such a way, you know, there's a way to talk about it, but it tends to have, I know from experience, you know, it has more relevance.
Well, the one I'm looking at in particular is Elizabeth Goodwin, who was a professor in this building from 2000 to 2006.
Yeah.
And 2010,
right,
pled guilty
right.
to fraud and really screwed up 4 or 5 graduate students. And I'm wondering if that still echoes through this place, that we have a rather remarkable pointed public case study, and that the people that got hurt the most were the grad students and the postdocs.
That's right.
Because they're the ones that had the guts to speak up, and it cost them time, if not their career path.
I used to teach Elizabeth Goodwin's case in the class. You know, when you teach, again, I think teaching this effectively, constantly updating it. But a big theme that we have when we talk about cases is that, because these are classes for students, right? Is that students are often the ones that bear the brunt. And so that's why, you know, it's when you get junior students, you're educating them on, okay, this is what you need to look for. When you're thinking about joining a lab, what should you look for? You're not just looking for a dynamic, you know, interesting project, you know. Is this individual someone you want to spend 5, 6 years of your life with? Do they have the right sort of moral fiber, if you will? You know, you can take the measure of people before you work with them. Yeah.
Tom, may I comment on that? My name is John Krieger. I'm a retired investigator from ORI. There have been 3 findings by the Public Health Service involving the University of Wisconsin. Betsy Goodman was the second. She was found misrepresenting information on an unfunded
public grant
renewal,
yeah.
which is no big thing. It would deserve a slap on the wrist rather than the $50,000 fine, which happened here because of political concerns.
Okay.
ORI didn't come to a finding of misconduct on that, but came to a debarment based on the fact that the state's attorney lost the evidence and we had nothing to review. The first finding here in Wisconsin established legal precedents for appeals in the under the various legal regulatory appeals, and the second one was more, and the third one was more recent. There have been specific cases here which would be very instructive.
Yeah, so the ORI, the Office of Research Integrity, is where you go and you see the. So we have federal. So one of the things that's changed over time is that the federal government ultimately compelled universities that have public funding to report investigations. They didn't used to do that. And so university, it was kind of like, again, the Wild West. They'd investigate any way they wanted. And then if they found something bad, they didn't necessarily need to report it. So someone could go to another state and be employed somewhere else and it would never come to light. It'd be known in that university. And so then out of that is where we got the Office of Research Integrity. And so then the Office of Research Integrity also can conduct investigations independently. Universities like this one have to report to the ORI, and then if findings are ultimately corroborated and found, then they're reported. So you can go and you can find basically the outline of the case. And I think that, you know, so all universities, let's be clear, have had problems. It's the nature of it. It's a big problem. And so there are the real high-profile ones. The best example, not here, of course, it's Duke. Duke had a really high-profile case about 7-8 years ago involving personalized medicine and a whole bunch of fraudulent work conducted by a medical doctor, Anil Poti, in the laboratory of a very famous breast cancer researcher, Joseph Nevins. And there was a 60-minute special on that. Maybe some of you might have even seen it. A huge case. Over 100 patients were treated in clinical trials that were fraudulent. And so then just about 2 years later, 2 years ago, there was another massive case, about $200 million in research grants, one individual in one department over the years. And that's a whistleblower case. So someone came forth and exposed it, and then filed a lawsuit called a Ketam lawsuit. So if you know, like Lance Armstrong, there was this fellow that filed a lawsuit on behalf of the government, and the government joins it, and then it's kind of like, I think, back from the organized crime era. If it succeeds, you get triple damages. So if it's $200 million in fraud from Duke, it's $600 million would be the payout, and then the whistleblower would get 1/3 of it. So that's happened, and then just this year, partly because of all that, Duke was placed on exceptional status by the National Institutes of Health. One of the things that you have to do now if you're a researcher at Duke, no matter where you are, is if you put in a grant, so grants have different sort of scrutiny, and federal grants that are $250,000 a year or less are called modular budgets, is what we call them. And so you don't have to specify all the little things, this many test tubes, what have you. You just say, okay, this is my budget. If you go over 250, you have to specify all that. So when you're at Duke, if you're below 250, everyone's got to specify. So when a university becomes exceptional in the eyes of regulatory bodies, again, that's like being on the retraction watch leaderboard, something you do not want. So every single researcher at Duke has to talk about all the test tubes and all the little PCR kits and everything, no matter what the dollar amount on the grant. So it's, we pay attention to that's the teeth that the federal agencies have to try to compel universities to do the right thing and to have the right level of oversight. Ultimately, it comes down to oversight.
Before we go on to other questions, if I made any fact errors or if I might have said something that wasn't accurate, can you correct what I said?
No,
okay.
That's a good one. Is an interesting case.
Yeah, I couldn't tell whether you were adding on to what I said or that I said
she
wrong.
Today would have received a sanction. They're called sanctions rather than penalties because they're meant as a corrective process. And her sanction would have been 1 year of supervision as opposed to being drawn into civil court for $50,000. And that was that was the way that the university case evolved. Okay.
Because what I'm reading here.
The first case with James Abbs was interesting because it established the rights of scientists to appeal of PHS findings under what I was trying to think of was the Administrative Procedures Act. It's everyone's right before the government takes money away from you, which is the only sanction that they can really, the most extreme they can do. And that really did have a significant effect on the whole misconduct apparatus in the U.S. What you said was correct.
Essentially, we have this question, that if a scientist commits fraud, so one thing I'd say is that these cases are really complex, as and sometimes it's hard to get, it's gray. You've got, in Elizabeth Goodwin's case, you've got members of her laboratory, and then you've got her word. So, we could talk for hours about some of the details there. But I think that one of the questions that we have that we talk about in the class, and I think that's really pertinent today, is if someone does commit misconduct and fraud on a publicly funded grant that comes from taxpayer dollars, should they pay back the money? Should they, as individuals, be held culpable? Should the university pay back the money? This is in many cases what happens. So who pays, who is responsible for that? And so I don't think this is completely settled law today. Yeah?
I have a question about the growing research and interdisciplinary research where you have people speaking different languages. and maybe I misunderstood you, but especially on this evening, that the reference of 6 million were 6 million Jews only, 2/3 of the Jewish population of Europe. The additional attributes that you talked about are additional to the 6 million alone people who were killed.
I said over 6 million Jews, gypsies, Poles, and homosexuals. Yeah, I mean, you know, I agree with you. So I was going over that fairly quickly, and but you know, the point of that, what I would say is that, so you and I can have this discussion. For students today, this is not current, pertinent information for them. You know, so most ethics courses, when they talk about human experimentation, they don't start with World War II. They start relatively recently. There's the Helsinki Code, there are 10 principles. So it's a choice to teach, to start from there. And I think, so the reason I like that is because there are lots of other things I didn't have time to talk to you about. So I'm in a pharmaceutical sciences program. And the role of German pharma in the final solution, the gas, the chemicals that were used, they were tried in the Nuremberg trials. So to me, that's relevant for training students that are going to go into the pharmaceutical industry. Because you might end up at a company where, you know, well, let's just say that the prevailing winds in your country are such that there's pressure put on companies to do things for, you know, untoward purposes. You know, huh? Yeah. Yes, and maybe over down here. Well, back.
Yeah. Speaking of the prevailing winds, I'm following the replication crisis. I follow a lot of scientists on Twitter. I look at Retraction Watch, and every once in a while I get really scared because I agree with this, you know, earnest effort to be as honest as possible and recognizing that the stakes are very high, but at the same time we have an administration which is doubting science results, putting non-scientists in charge of science people, and how do you cope with that? I get afraid that scientists are going to be exposed by doing this self-criticism in the front of this amoral administration. I don't know how to
whatever you think about the Trump administration, the example I use of Nazi medicine and Hitler co-opting. So 100 years ago, German science, German medicine, German pharma was preeminent in the world. Can't emphasize that enough. You did a PhD, some of you probably are in this category, where you did a PhD at one point. You learned German to read the literature because, you know, there's still lots of really fantastic, you know, German journals that have gone, you know, like have this history. And of course, some of them are going to have, if you go back to that period, they're going to have work that it's all still there, that's questionable. So we're not being recorded anymore, is that right? No, so
you are being recorded.
But now I am. Okay, so, you know, I mean, I can't really, leaving politics out of it,
put it in two different categories and compartmentalize. How do you deal with the,
yeah.
Because it scares me. I don't want my friends to be hurt.
This is the challenge we have today. You know, when essentially there's a battle or an assault on truth in society, and then we live we're in a community and in an ecosystem where truth is the currency that needs to be in science. And so imagine how confusing that is, not for you and for me, but if you're in your 20s. Imagine how confusing that is. So this is why this kind of education is even more important today than it ever has been before, because you have to address it. You have to, like lots of things I didn't have the time to get into. Gender equity in science, huge topic. Lots and lots of things. And so, you know, you have a limited amount of time in a course like this, in a graduate survey research ethics course. We meet 14 times. We allow the students to choose some of the topics they're going to write on. But the problem you identify is I agree with you completely. It's a real problem, and I mean, it can lead you to despair sometimes, of like,
Couple more questions.
difficult.
3, 4.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things that came to mind as we're talking about this is the role that humanities have played and are playing in your course. I mean, you're talking about philosophy, ethics, history, and it's more of an observation. I wonder how many people going into science have a lot of exposure to the humanities as undergrads or graduate students. I know some of the students I work with at the libraries, they're getting into it because there's so many requirements for, you know, they want to be genetic counselors or whatever. So there's so many science requirements. And where do these other things come in?
It emphasizes the value of a well-rounded education, because you get that as an undergraduate. When you come to graduate school, it's focus. And so, you know, not everyone even thinks research ethics courses in graduate school are a good use of time. You know, like not all of my colleagues are supportive always about that. But I think that, you know, it's one reason I use that little Obama clip, you know, about your life's narrative and what is your, you know, what's your driving principle? What is your own moral fiber, you know, and where do you learn that? What have you read that influences your thought process? And I think, you know, science is very specialized and it's very reductionist. And when you get into graduate school, you often don't have a lot of time. And so this is one reason why I'm telling our graduate students, try to take a little time and read other things and, you know, explore your interests, pursue things that, you know, that are interesting to you. But I agree with you that, you know, the time for getting that well-rounded education is going to be when you're an undergraduate, when you have, you know, because a scientist is not typically going to be able to take a course in literature when they're a graduate student. That had to have happened before.
A couple more.
Where do you place theorists? There are certain fields, like when there was string theory was popular, that's the time when a lot of people can jump in, publish papers, because they're so difficult to verify.
Yeah.
And where do you put those categories of people? Whether you think they genuinely propose a theory, or have proposed a theory just to get into the publishing realm,
right?
Such as string theory and others that was taking place.
So, you know, as a neuroscientist, a biophysicist, you know, I really love, you know, physics is, when you get into the pure sciences, you know, there's something very beautiful about that. But of course, it's very inaccessible to most people. And so what I would say about that is, fields have a responsibility to police themselves. Fields have a responsibility. I showed you that short clip of a German scientist in Cologne, Benno Müller-Hill. Well, one reason I show that is he wrote a beautiful book called Murderous Science, where he basically detailed the German scientific establishment, anthropologists, psychologists, and their role in the final solution. And one of the quotes I've always loved from him, he says, any branch of science for which it can be said, this is no longer true, there are no truths. What do I take away from that? If you're in a field, and you know, let's say string theory, and you are a theorist that works in that area, and you know that someone's published something that is garbage, what's your responsibility to challenge that? And I would say it's high. Because if you don't challenge it and you allow your field, like maybe, you know, some fields it's almost like a cooperative crime where you get teams of scientists banding together to peddle something that is not true. And they support each other, and they review each other's papers and each other's grants. This goes on, sadly. And so that area is under pressure because other scientists have to come forward. They have a responsibility to fight that. Because if they don't, and you're in some other field and you look at that research, and you know, okay, there was this garbage that was in the field for 10, 15 years. Where were all the voices trying to correct it? If they're not there, then you're in that other field, you're looking at that field, and you say, I'm not going to believe any of that work. That's the responsibility. Any branch of science for which it could be said that this is no longer true, there are no truths. We all, as scientists, so you can say the big community, then there's the smaller communities, finally your little field, you have a responsibility to police it and to, maybe police is the wrong word, but to try to provide the pressure to not allow the predators, the people that really game the system to come in and flourish and do well. This is a challenge in science.
One more. You mentioned the Helsinki Code. What is that?
Pardon me?
You mentioned the Helsinki Code.
Yeah.
What is that?
So a number of countries got together after the Nuremberg Code that was used to try, various Nazi physicians and people that were involved in principally the medical experimentation aspects of the concentration camps. And that wasn't good enough. I mean, that was a code that was developed to try criminals. And so, but it led to this idea, well, there should be concepts, there should be a code or convention that governs human subjects, human research and experimentation, that most of the major countries of the world should try to come together and agree upon. Because medical research is global. Even then it was global. And so the Helsinki Code was they came together, like lots of different stakeholders, and developed added on to the informed consent and a whole bunch of other things. And ultimately it's about a list of 10 points. And so then that's been updated over the years. And that really is what guides institutional review boards and how you think about doing human subjects research today.
All right. You want to do one, Tom?
Let's have a pragmatic question. Why is so much research not reproducible? And is it growing? Is it a matter of more liars, or people don't communicate in enough detail? Many times in a paper they send you endlessly backward through a stream of references. It comes around in a circle. It doesn't really tell you what they did. Is that a big cause? That's pretty disturbing, that number, 11%.
I think it's a bit of both. I think that, I do think there's more nefarious activity today because of the money pressure. I also think that some work that is, that's correct, laboratories are not always forthcoming in publishing all the details needed to replicate it because they want a competitive advantage for a certain amount of time, knowing that only they can do it.
I think of the work, somebody claimed they make pluripotent cells by putting acid on cells.
We spend like half of the class on Monday on that case.
I read about that and went, God, I wish I'd have thought that. But it was never reproducible, right?
Yeah, so there's a famous case out of Japan a couple of years ago, and it was this method that probably would have won a Nobel Prize if it was true, and it was called STAP. So stimulus triggered acquisition of pluripotency. So it's basically how can you generate stem cells or cells that can basically become any cell in the body from cells that are highly differentiated. How can you take them back? And so there was a Nobel Prize awarded to a Japanese scientist for induced pluripotent stem cells not so long ago. So there was this explosive study that was partnered between Brigham and Women's, Harvard, and then Japanese labs, Riken labs in Japan. And ultimately it was found to be fraudulent. And one of the famous, very well-established Japanese scientists who was involved in that hung himself, committed suicide. The Japanese woman that conducted the studies was the first author. Like she had these press conferences which are hard to watch. Like more microphones like it's, you know, like she's won the U.S. Open or something, and then, you know, a lot of bowing. A horrible, horrible, horrible outcome for many people, and certainly culpability on the part of this Harvard scientist, Charles Vacanti, who had the idea. Originally, the idea was treat cells with acid, and that stress will take them back, and then you can create, you know, it was so simple. And, you know, the idea came out of like the battlefield and what have you. You know, you can, extreme stresses in the body sometimes can lead to growth of bone or some unusual tissue. So yeah, that is now a classic case in, at least in my course. You know, it's a good example, and it has a lot of different moving parts to it. You know, for if you're a student, again, coming from another part of the world, why is there pressure to develop a source of stem cells that doesn't involve embryonic stem cells? You know, like not everyone is knowledgeable about that. Certainly our students come in, you know, it gets into the politics of abortion, embryonic supply. You'd love to get a very simple method where you could take cells, skin cells, and then basically convert them and allow them to be any cell in the body.
Could I ask you another quick one?
Yeah.
Do you discuss, this has happened a lot lately, but very slippery slope. People are on a Western blog, it's not pretty. They want it to be pretty for the journal. So they take a negative control using computer out of another gel and put it in that one. It doesn't really change the outcome, but it's not exactly honest. Papers have been retracted for that.
Yeah.
And the hammer's dropped on that.
Yeah.
It must be a line somewhere.
Yeah, so I mean, journals have policies on that, on, you know, not altering images, and then there is software to look at that they can use to screen it. It's kind of become a bit of an arms race. It's kind of, so I'm a fan of cycling, and which I always tell my students, you know, professional cycling, which basically means, you know, as an American, I have no one to talk to. So not Lance, you know, I followed cycling back in the Lance Armstrong days, but I still follow it. And what you would say about performance-enhancing drugs, not just in cycling, but in sport in general, that it's an arms race. That the people developing the ways to trick the system and to get ahead and to change physiology and evade testing. And then you got the people on the other side that are trying to develop the tests to catch it. And this same sort of thing's happening, obviously, in science, that you've got all these really, you know, bright people. And if someone has the propensity to cross over to the dark side, to try to, you know, trick the system, boy, you know, I'm not sure we have enough resources on the other side to combat that. And so it's an arms race, unfortunately. It really is. So do we...
Thank you very much.
Thank you.